Section 16, Chapter 10 of the Life and Adventures of Kit Carson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Dorr. The Life and Adventures of Kit Carson by DeWitt C. Peters. Section 16, Chapter 10. Fremont en route for California. His men are anxious to punish the Klamath Indians. Kit Carson, in command of 10 men, is sent on ahead to reconnoiter. He discovers the main village of these Indians. The attack and the victory. Beautiful lodges. The trophies mostly destroyed. Fremont saves Kit Carson's life. The journey resumed. The Sacramento Valley. An Indian ambuscade. One savage defies the party. Kit Carson shoots him. The Klamath Indians still on the warpath. Another lesson given to them. A thief is shot. Arrival at Lawson's trading post. A period of inactivity. A detachment sent to capture Sonoma. Prisoners taken. The Mexicans come to punish the Americans. Their courage deserts them. The retreat. The pursuit. Fremont goes to Sutter's Fort and establishes a military post. Monterey is taken by the American squadron. Fremont marches there. Further operations. The taking of Los Angeles. The news of the war having been declared between the United States and Mexico determined Fremont to return to California, and in doing so he decided to enter that country by a new route of his own selection. He commenced his journey by traveling around Lake Tlamath, and had not proceeded far in that direction before he found himself encamped on a small stream, which empties into the lake, nearly opposite to the place where his 3 men were killed. The distance of each day's progress had been carefully reckoned and noted by the party. Upon their minds there was still resting a sadness, which their leader saw was only to be effaced by a satisfactory revenge, and that they were eager to obtain it before quitting the country. Perhaps, also, their commanding officer thought it best, while the opportunity offered, for the benefit of his countrymen, whom he felt sure would someday possess this territory, to impress these savages with the power and bravery of the white men. Whatever was the object to be gained, it matters not in relating the particulars. The next morning he sent Kit Carson on ahead with 10 chosen men, giving him orders to the effect that if he discovered a large village of Indians, which was the general surmise, without being himself seen, he was to send back word, when he, Fremont, would hasten on with reinforcements in order to make the assault. If it should happen that the Indians were the first to be apprised of his near approach, then without delay Carson was to engage them, as he thought best. Acting under these instructions, Kit Carson with his detail of men set out and fortunately soon found a fresh trail that led directly to where the savages had established their village. The Indian village numbered 50 lodges, and to each wigwam the mountaineers estimated 3 braves, as this is the complement of men who live in one of these huts on the prairies and in the Rocky Mountains, thus making the force of the Indians to be in the neighborhood of 150. From the commotion noticed in the village it was evident to all present that the tribe had become aware of danger, and that there was no time to be lost in sending back the desired information. Kit Carson, notwithstanding the strength of his enemies, determined to hazard an attack, and after a brief consultation with his companions, he decided to take advantage of the confusion that was existing among the red men by charging right in among them. If ever there is a time when Indians will stand their ground, it is when defending their families. Therefore, on this occasion, the white men were warmly received, but they fought with such a degree of desperation as they themselves had never done before. The result was that the savages became panic-stricken, and soon afterwards fled, leaving everything they possessed behind them. The victors, after pursuing the Indians for some distance and adding a few more to the list of killed, returned to the village, which they found to be rich in booty. The lodges here taken, Kit Carson describes as being the most tasty pieces of handiwork that Indian skill could devise, and surpassed anything of the kind that he had previously looked upon. They were made of the broad leaves of the swamp flag, which were beautifully and intricately woven together. Within the wigwams, the party found a very large amount of fish in different stages of preservation for future use. Wishing to do these people as much harm as possible, and thus be even with them for their recent savage cruelties on their own party, Kit Carson gave the order to collect everything in the lodges and arrange the articles in such manner that fire would either destroy or completely damage them. Having accomplished this work, the lighted tinder was applied when the flames leaped high up in the air, forming a fit funeral pyre for their slain companions. Fremont saw the reflection of the fire and also the smoke, and at once knew that Kit Carson was engaged with the Indians. Consequently, he pushed on at a very rapid pace to assist him. He arrived too late for what the men called the sport, but instead heard the report of his lieutenant and guide, Kit Carson, whose words, to use his, Fremont's, own language, are synonymous with truth. The gloom which had prevailed over the party, while the men recounted to their friends the details of the fight, was temporarily dispelled, and while thus engaged, the command moved on about 2 miles from the Indian village. Having here selected a site, they went into camp. After comfortably stowing themselves away in this resting place, another war talk was called, and what was best to be done was canvassed over. After the adjournment of the council, Fremont decided to send back 20 men, under Richard Owens, to the neighborhood of the ruins of the village, there to conceal themselves and await the return of the Indians, who it was thought might come back to look after their dead. He did so, and Owens had not been secreted a great while before about 50 savages returned, and by the moon's light were quite visible. As had been previously agreed upon, word was sent by a trusty messenger to Fremont, who with 6 companions, Kit Carson being of the number, hastened on horseback to join his outpost. For fear of being discovered, Fremont chose a different route from the one taken by Owens, which was quite direct, while that of the former was circuitous. On approaching the smoldering remains of the village, Kit Carson discovered only one Indian wandering about on the ground. As soon almost as he was seen by the party, they made a dash at him. Kit Carson was in the advance, and on arriving within about 10 feet of the warrior, he drew up his horse and brought his rifle to his shoulder to fire. But the gun only snapped, and left its owner in a very precarious situation, as the red man had already drawn the string of his bow to plant an arrow in the body of his adversary. A moment more, and, in all probability, Kit Carson would have been breathing his last. Fremont saw the danger his friend was in, although Kit had tried to avoid the arrow by throwing himself on one side of his horse. With much forethought, as well as personal exposure, he plunged the rowels of his spurs deep into his riding animal. The noble horse, obeying the impetus thus given by his rider, made a few extra strides, until he reached, knocked down, and passed over the Indian, thereby causing his arrow to fly in a different direction from the one intended. Before the savage could regain his feet, a ball from one of the rifles belonging to the party had sent him to his last resting place. Fremont now learned from Owens that while the messenger was absent, the rest of the Indians had decamped, and as he had received orders from him to await his coming in case he found the enemy, therefore he was obliged to let the rascals quietly depart without firing into them, which was much to his own and his men's displeasure. It was now necessary to return without delay to their own camp, and thus anticipate the movements of the Indians, as they might conclude to make an attack in that quarter. But on arriving there they found everything safe, nor were they during that night in any way disturbed. Kit Carson was, and is still, very grateful to Fremont for thus interposing between him and almost certain death, for it would have been the work of an instant for the Indian warrior at 10 feet distance to have sent an arrow into some vital organ. It was such noble generosity, bravery, and disinterested exposure in the hour of peril, in order to serve his men, that strongly cemented Fremont to them. Indeed, in all of his expeditions he had such command over his employees that little or no trouble ever occurred among them while on their marches, although they had privations and dangers to undergo that would often try men of the most even temper. On the day following the one on which his party had encountered and chastised the Tlamath Indians, Fremont started for the valley of the Sacramento. The expedition was progressing well, and was 4 days out from this last camp, when as 2 of the men, whose names were Maxwell and Archambault, were out hunting at a distance of about 3 miles on one side of their friends, they were surprised at seeing one Indian, on foot, approaching towards them. The hunters, in order to do away with all suspicion, at once halted and laid down their arms, to show the warrior that they were friendly disposed. They thought it was best to have a talk with him, and question him in regard to the country they were in. As he showed no symptoms of fear, but kept coming on, they supposed that he had understood their actions. Therefore they paid but little attention to him, until they saw him stop. Their curiosity was now excited to know his intentions, and as they watched his movements they saw him take some young crows from his quiver, and after untying the string that held them, he concealed them to his satisfaction in the grass, and again moved forward. But while doing so, he was busy arranging his weapons for immediate use. The white men were not astonished at this, for they concluded that he was only preparing himself against danger. The Indian slowly advanced to a spot that was within 15 yards of the hunters, when he again stopped, and commenced shooting his arrows at them. At first they dodged about and made signs for him to desist, as they were friends, but to their admonitions he paid not the least attention. Several of the missiles had come near causing them bodily injury. After a time, forbearance ceased to be a virtue. Raising his rifle, one of the men fired, when, to use mountaineer parlance, the Indian went under. What could have been the foolhardy ideas of this warrior that compelled him to take such a course as he did, not one of the party, when they were informed of the adventure, could conjecture, but a fact it is that he lost his life and his scalp by his indiscretion. In due time the command reached the Sacramento River and were proceeding on the trail down that stream when they came to a point not far from a deep canyon, the sides of which were almost perpendicular and composed of cragged rocks. Fremont decided not to pass through this deep gorge, but instead to travel around it, and he did so by crossing the river. It proved afterwards to be a very fortunate change, for their old enemies, the Tlamath Indians, had concealed themselves there, thinking, as a matter of course, that the white men would keep the trail. Seeing that the white men were not coming into the ambuscade laid for them, the Indians became so disappointed that they boldly ventured forth from their hiding places. A few, more daring than the rest, advanced into open ground, when Carson, Godey, and another member of the party made a dash at them. They all ran except one warrior, and as the charging party were mounted on mules, they made but poor progress in overtaking them. The one Indian, who apparently had resolved to make war on his own account, concealed himself behind a rock, strung his bow, putting several arrows in his mouth, and thus awaited the advance of his foes. Kit Carson and Godey soon came within shooting distance, when he began to let fly his arrows, and kept it up so briskly that the men dodged about without being able to do anything else for some moments. At last, wearying of this dangerous sport, Kit Carson dismounted and crept around until he obtained a good sight at the Indian, when he drew up his rifle, fired, and sent a bullet through his heart. From this dead brave, Kit Carson took a beautifully wrought bow and quiver, which still contained a large number of arrows, and which he presented, on rejoining the party, to Lieutenant Gillespie. It is a pity that such a brave man as this savage was should have met with such an inglorious death, but it was his own seeking, for he had attacked the wrong persons. Another 24 hours now passed by without another further annoyance from the Indians, who, notwithstanding the late forcible instruction they had received, still continued to hover around and follow after the exploring party. On encamping the next evening, after Kit Carson had killed the Indian, as above described, the party found themselves entirely destitute of anything to eat, although they were very hungry. Game had all at once become very scarce, as the hunters whose turn it was to be out that day had returned unsuccessful. 2 more men were then sent out, in hopes that by perseverance they might find something. They had not proceeded far before they discovered an Indian watching their camp, as if awaiting a favorable opportunity to make a descent on the animals. Step, one of these hunters, crept unperceived by the red man until he was within range of his rifle, when he fired and killed the would-be thief. No other game could be found, so the hunters returned, and the whole party retired to rest supperless, and arose the next morning to fast again. That day, however, they found and killed some game, and for the time being their appetites were once more appeased. Fremont was now on his way to Peter Lawson's fort, where he arrived safely after several days of hard traveling. At this place the party rested for about 1 week, but the desire to have an active share in the approaching hostilities caused Fremont to delay no longer than was absolutely necessary. Hence he started and went to a point lower down on the Sacramento, known to the mountaineers under the name of the Buttes. Here a camp was made, and here Fremont had decided to wait positive orders concerning the war, and until these instructions should arrive, he employed his men in hunting. After several days spent in this way, he began to weary of inactivity. He thought that in all probability war had commenced, and finally he decided to take the responsibility of sending a part of his force to surprise Sonoma, a Mexican military post that had but a weak garrison. This the party accomplished to the entire satisfaction of their commander. They captured and made prisoners of war at this fort 1 general and 2 captains, besides taking several cannon and quite a quantity of small arms. It was about this time that news reached Fremont which convinced him that hostilities had already commenced, and that both countries were taking active measures to carry the war on with vigor. He set out immediately on the receipt of this information, and joined his detail of men at Sonoma. During his stay at this fort, General Castro sent one of his captains with a large force of Mexicans from San Francisco with orders to drive the Americans out of the country. This command came and accidentally fell upon and butchered 2 men, whom Fremont had sent out as messengers to inform all American settlers that Sonoma had been taken by him, and that thither they could fly for safety. The gallant Mexican captain, on seeing and hearing that Fremont's forces were anxious to meet him, becoming disheartened, began to retreat and was pursued by the exploring party. For 6 days they thus followed the retreating enemy, whose courage had evidently deserted them, though they had triple the force of their pursuers. So hot was the chase that the Mexicans deserted many of their animals, which, as a matter of course, fell into the hands of the Americans. Fremont, on finding that he could not overtake the enemy, returned to Sonoma. The captain, with his Mexican command, as was afterwards learned, did not remain at San Francisco. No doubt he did not like to trust himself within reach of Fremont, for he continued his march until he reached the pueblo of Los Angeles, where he was rejoined by General Castro, who reorganized the forces and assumed the command himself. The exploring party had now become a military expedition, and around this nucleus the Americans, then in California, flocked to pour out their vengeance against their country's foes. Having quite a little army at his disposal, Fremont left a strong detachment at Sonoma, and departed with the rest of his command for Sutter's Fort. On arriving there, he placed the fort under military rule, and left as prisoners General Vallejos and the 2 captains who had been captured at Sonoma. Also, an American by the name of Lace, who was a brother-in-law to General Vallejos, and whose predilections appeared to lean in favor of the Mexican side. With all his mountain men, including Kit Carson, Fremont then took up his line of march towards Monterey, for the purpose of attacking and taking possession of the town. But this movement had been anticipated by Commodore Sloat and the American squadron. Soon after Fremont's arrival at Monterey, where he was very kindly received by the Commodore and his officers, Commodore Sloat left the country, and the command devolved upon Commodore Stockton. A consultation having been held among the officers, it was the prevailing opinion that it would be impossible to overtake and engage the Mexicans by following them up on land. Therefore, Fremont asked for a ship to take his force to San Diego, where he could obtain animals and march on to Los Angeles. The United States vessel Cyane, under the command of Captain Dupont, was furnished him for this undertaking by Commodore Stockton. In 4 days' time the party arrived at San Diego, where they landed. They there parted with the ship and the gallant captain, with many pleasant reminiscences of their short voyage. At San Diego, Fremont found himself at the head of about 150 men, which was not a very strong force to be in an enemy's country with, especially so far from their homes as they were. However, nearly every man was a veteran in war, and the whole body felt themselves invincible, which was a source of great consolation to their leader. From San Diego, parties of the command were sent to scour the neighboring country, in order to bring in a sufficient number of horses to mount the men. This being accomplished, Fremont set out for Los Angeles, where the governor and General Castro had a force of 700 men at their disposal. These officials, with their soldiers, on learning the near approach of the Americans, broke up and fled, most of them taking the road to Sonora, while the balance scattered, not apparently caring where they went, as long as they did not come in contact with the Americans. Fremont marched within about 1 league of the town, and encamped to await, as had been previously agreed upon, the arrival of Commodore Stockton, who soon joined him at this place with a party of sailors and marines. "As fine a body of men," says Kit Carson, "as ever I looked upon." When the 2 commands had been consolidated, they marched direct for Los Angeles, which they easily captured, as its would-be defenders had some days before deserted it. In this town the command was quartered for some time. But as it is our intention to follow the career of Kit Carson, who shortly after their arrival had been detailed for important duty, which placed him in new scenes, hence we are necessitated to take leave of affairs as they transpired there, and hereafter revert to them casually as they connect with our narrative. End of Section 16, Chapter 10.